The alarm tore through the corridor before I even understood what I was hearing. My translator lagged half a second behind the sound, and in that half second my body did something it had not done in decades of service. It froze. Every training cycle I had completed as a consulate observer told me to remain still during an unknown event, to gather data before acting, to let the pattern reveal itself. That is how my people survive. We wait, we watch, we calculate before we move. The humans did none of that. I had been aboard the Horizon for 11 days, assigned to observe the crew as part of a long-standing agreement between my government and theirs, a small gesture of goodwill meant to ease centuries of distance between our species. My task was simple on paper. Watch, record, report. Nothing about the mission suggested danger. Nothing prepared me for the moment Daniel Cross shoved past me in the corridor, half-dressed, sprinting toward the sound of shrieking metal with nothing but a hand tool and no evidence of fear on his face. I called after him, asking what he intended to do, but he was already gone around the bend, boots slapping against the deck plating. Behind me, another voice cut through the noise. Emma Fox, the pilot, was already awake, already moving, already talking into her wristcom as if she had rehearsed this exact emergency 100 times before. She had not. I checked the logs later. This was the first hull stress event the Horizon had ever experienced. I want to explain, before I go further, what it means for my kind to witness this kind of behavior. My people are called the Ithrain. We built civilizations that lasted longer than most stars burn. We did this through patience, through stillness, through the belief that the wisest action is often no action at all. When a threat appears, we observe it fully before we respond, because a response born from urgency is a response born from error. This is not cowardice. It is discipline. It is the discipline that let us outlive 3 separate galactic ice ages. Humans do not seem to possess this discipline. Or perhaps they possess a different kind entirely, one that looks nothing like mine and yet, somehow, works. I followed Cross and Fox down the corridor, keeping enough distance to observe without interfering, though I quickly realized interference was not something anyone here would have noticed. The ship groaned again, a long metallic complaint that echoed through the walls like something alive and in distress. Warning lights bathed the corridor in a pulsing amber glow. My internal systems flagged a probability of structural failure at 11%, rising. 11% should not have been enough to justify the speed at which these 2 humans were moving. On my homeworld, 11% would have triggered a full council review before any physical action was taken. Here, it triggered a sprint. We reached the lower maintenance deck within 90 seconds. Cross was already on his knees beside an access panel, prying it open with his bare hands before Fox even finished handing him the tool she carried. Sparks bit at his fingers. He did not stop. I asked him, as calmly as my translator could manage, whether he required assistance or containment protocol. He laughed. Actually laughed, in the middle of what could have been a hull breach, and said something I will never forget. He said the ship was not going to fix itself while we stood around being polite about it. I did not understand the humor. I still do not fully understand it, even now, long after everything that followed. But I understood, in that moment, that something fundamental about these creatures did not match anything in my species' history of contact with alien life. They were not reckless in the way some violent species are reckless. They were not calm in the way my people are calm. They existed in some strange, restless middle place, a place where doing nothing felt more dangerous to them than doing something wrong. Captain Laura Bennett arrived moments later, and I expected her, as the ranking officer, to order everyone back, to demand a full diagnostic before any hands touched exposed wiring. Instead, she dropped to the deck beside Cross without hesitation, pulled a second panel free with a practiced twist, and began issuing commands so quickly that even my translator struggled to keep pace. Rerouting power, isolating the coolant line, calling for a manual override on a system that, according to the ship's own specifications, was not supposed to be manually overridden under any circumstances. Within 4 minutes, The groaning stopped. The amber lights faded to a steady blue. The 11% probability I had calculated dropped to 0. I stood in the corridor long after the crisis had passed, running the sequence over and over in my mind, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. 4 minutes. My people would have spent 4 minutes simply agreeing on who should speak first in an emergency briefing. These 3 humans, none of whom had discussed a plan beforehand, none of whom had waited for authorization, had solved a structural failure through nothing but instinct and an apparent inability to sit still while something was wrong. Bennett noticed me standing there and offered a small, tired smile. She asked if I was all right, as though I were the one who had just crawled through sparking machinery. I told her I was undamaged, which was true, though something in my understanding of the universe had shifted slightly, and that was harder to explain. Later, in my private quarters, I filed my first report to the consulate. I described the event factually: hull stress, rapid crew response, successful resolution. I did not mention the strange tightness I felt in my chest cavity while watching them work, a sensation my physiology has no proper name for, something between alarm and fascination. I did not mention that I had begun to suspect the danger these creatures posed to the galaxy was not the danger anyone had warned me about. Over the following days, I began to notice the pattern more clearly. It was not confined to emergencies. It touched everything. I observed Cross spend his rest cycle, a period explicitly designated by the ship's schedule for recovery and stillness, rebuilding a food processing unit that already functioned perfectly well. When I asked why, he shrugged and said it could be better. Not that it was broken, not that it posed any risk, simply that it could be better, and that fact alone seemed to itch at him like something physically uncomfortable. I observed Fox spend hours in the observation deck, not resting, not socializing, but running flight simulations against scenarios that had never occurred, and by every reasonable measure, were unlikely to ever occur. She told me she liked knowing what she would do if they did. I observed Marcus Doyle, the ship's security officer, pace the length of the vessel during his off hours, not out of duty, but because sitting still for too long made him restless, in a way he could not fully articulate. He used a word I had to look up: fidgety. It was not a technical term. It was not a diagnosis. It was simply a description of a state that seemed to afflict nearly every human aboard the vessel, to varying degrees, at nearly all times. My people do not have a word for this. We have words for patience, for stillness, for the wisdom of waiting. We do not have a word for the particular discomfort a human feels when nothing is happening. I began to wonder if this was a flaw, an evolutionary leftover from some more dangerous era of their history, a nervous energy that had once kept them alive on a hostile world and had simply never faded, even now that they possessed ships and technology capable of crossing the void between stars. I wondered if it was something they would eventually grow out of, the way a species matures past its more primitive instincts. I was wrong about that, though I would not understand how wrong for some time yet. On the 6th day since the hull incident, I asked Bennett directly why her crew behaved the way they did. Why they could not simply wait for instructions, why they treated small imperfections as urgent problems, why doing nothing seemed to cause them more visible distress than doing something risky. She considered the question for a long moment, longer than I expected from someone who rarely paused before speaking. She told me that humans had spent most of their history not knowing what was going to kill them next: weather, hunger, disease, each other. She said that waiting calmly for a threat to reveal itself, the way my people were trained to do, was a luxury her species had never really been afforded. If you waited too long back home, she said, you did not get a second chance to wait better. You simply did not get another chance at all. I asked if this instinct still served a purpose now, in an age of stable ships and advanced medicine, and far fewer immediate threats to human life. She smiled slightly and said that was the strange part. It never really turned off. Even when nothing was actively trying to kill them, humans still felt that old pressure, that itch to fix, to improve, to move, to prepare for a danger that might never come. She said some of them called it ambition. Others called it anxiety. She said maybe it was both, tangled together so tightly that no one could fully separate the two anymore. I did not have a response to that. My people had spent generations perfecting the art of contentment, of accepting what is, rather than chasing what could be. Humans, it seemed, had built their entire civilization on the opposite principle, and somehow it had carried them from stone tools to starships in a fraction of the time it had taken my own species to make similar progress. That night, alone in my quarters, I ran a comparison through my private data files. Ithrain technological development, measured across recorded history, against human technological development, measured across theirs. The results unsettled me enough that I checked the calculation twice, certain I had made an error. I had not. Whatever this restlessness was, whatever discomfort drove these creatures to keep moving, keep building, keep questioning long after any reasonable threat had passed, it had made them extraordinarily fast. Faster than my people, faster, according to some of the older consulate archives I had access to, than almost any other species we had ever encountered. I did not yet understand why my superiors had always described humans with such careful, guarded language in official briefings. I had assumed it was simple unfamiliarity, the natural caution any civilization feels toward a new and unpredictable neighbor. But lying in my quarters that night, replaying the image of Cross crawling into sparking machinery without a second of hesitation, I began to suspect there was something more specific behind that caution, something my briefing documents had not fully explained. I did not know it yet, but within days I would find myself staring directly into the reason. The ship shuddered again on the 9th day, though this time it was not damage, it was discovery. Sensors detected a debris field ahead of us, vast and silent, tumbling slowly through the dark, in a pattern too regular to be natural. Bennett called it to the bridge immediately, and within minutes the entire crew had gathered, not out of fear, but out of something closer to excitement. I stood among them, watching the debris field grow larger on the main display, and felt that same strange tightness return to my chest. Whatever lay ahead, I understood with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that these humans were not going to wait for permission to investigate it. They never did. And somewhere deep in that drifting field of wreckage, something old and dangerous was about to meet the one kind of creature it had never learned to predict. Before we reached the debris field, there was one more evening aboard the Horizon that I have come to think of often, a quiet evening that seemed unremarkable at the time, but which, in hindsight, taught me more about human restlessness than almost anything else I witnessed during my assignment. I had requested, out of simple curiosity, to observe the crew during a designated rest period, a stretch of hours when the ship's schedule required nothing of anyone, no duties, no drills, no obligations of any kind. I expected stillness. I found instead a common area filled with quiet, restless activity that no one had assigned and no one seemed able to avoid. Fox was teaching herself a musical instrument she had never touched before, her fingers clumsy and uncertain against the strings, producing sounds that were, by any reasonable measure, unpleasant to listen to. When I asked why she persisted despite her evident lack of skill, she told me she had always meant to learn, and the not knowing how had begun to bother her more than the discomfort of practicing badly in front of others. Cross, seated nearby, had opened a small case of mechanical components entirely unrelated to any ship system, simply for the pleasure of building something from nothing in particular. Doyle read from a small data reader, though even his reading seemed restless somehow, his eyes moving quickly across the text, his free hand occasionally tapping out some rhythm only he could hear. Bennett moved between all of them, checking in, offering comments, never quite settling into stillness herself, despite technically being off duty for the first time in days. I asked her, gently, why none of them simply rested during their designated rest period. She looked at me with genuine confusion, as though the question itself did not quite make sense to her. She said this was resting, as far as she understood it. Not stillness, but a change in direction. She said humans rarely stopped moving entirely. They simply moved toward something different when duty no longer demanded a particular direction. I filed that observation away quietly, not yet understanding how deeply it would shape everything that followed. The debris field did not look dangerous at first. It looked like ruin, quiet and patient, thousands of fragments turning slowly in the dark, like the bones of something that had once been alive. My sensors identified the wreckage as belonging to no cataloged species, which alone should have been enough to keep any reasonable crew at a cautious distance until a proper survey team could be dispatched from a consulate outpost. That was the correct procedure. That was what the manual demanded. That was not what happened. Bennett gave the order to move closer within 20 minutes of detection. Not to attack, not to loot, simply to look. She called it a survey pass, though I noticed the way her eyes lit up when she said it, the same way Cross's hands had already begun twitching toward the console controls, the same way Fox leaned forward in her pilot's chair as though the ship itself might move faster if she wanted it badly enough. I asked whether this decision had been cleared with any external authority. She told me, without a trace of concern, that by the time authorization arrived, the debris field would likely have drifted into a different sector entirely, and the opportunity would be lost. I pointed out that opportunities lost to caution were rarely opportunities regretted. She looked at me with something like gentle amusement and said that in her experience, it was usually the other way around. We drifted into the outer edge of the field an hour later. Up close, the wreckage told a different story than the one my sensors had first suggested. These were not natural fragments or the debris of some ancient collision. This was warship architecture, blackened and twisted, bearing weapon scarring that matched no known conflict in consulate records. Something had fought here. Something had lost, badly, and whatever had won was nowhere to be seen. Doyle suggested, quite reasonably, that we should hold position and send a probe ahead instead of moving the ship any closer. Bennett agreed, which I noted with some relief, believing for a moment that discipline had finally asserted itself over instinct. The relief did not last. Within the hour, the probe had transmitted images of a structure buried deep within the debris field, mostly intact, far larger than anything around it, humming faintly, with a power signature that should not have existed after however many years this wreckage had been drifting. I watched the crew's reaction to this discovery with growing unease. There was no debate about whether to investigate further. There was only a debate about how quickly they could get there. Cross wanted to send a boarding team immediately. Fox wanted to fly the ship in herself rather than trust a shuttle. Bennett, to her credit, insisted on caution, though her version of caution still involved suiting up a small team within 2 hours and moving toward the structure with weapons drawn and curiosity burning far brighter than fear. I asked, perhaps too directly, whether anyone aboard this vessel ever felt the impulse to simply leave a mystery unsolved. Doyle laughed at that, not unkindly, and said that leaving a mystery unsolved was worse than any danger it might contain. He said the not knowing was the part that actually kept him awake at night, not the knowing. I did not understand that then. I understand it a great deal better now. We reached the structure 8 hours later. It was ancient, built from an alloy my scanners could not identify, its surface etched with markings that resembled no written language in the consulate archive. A single door, sealed but not damaged, stood at its base like an invitation no reasonable creature should have accepted. Bennett accepted it anyway. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, standing behind the boarding team as the door ground open under Cross's manual effort, releasing a breath of air that had been trapped inside for who knew how many years. I felt fear. Real fear, the kind my species rarely experiences because we rarely place ourselves in situations that invite it. And yet, none of the humans around me appeared to share that fear in any way that slowed their movement. They felt it. I could see it in the tightness of Doyle's jaw, in the way Fox gripped her weapon a little too firmly. But the fear did not stop them. It seemed, if anything, to sharpen them, to focus their restlessness into something almost precise. Inside, the structure was a tomb of quiet ruin, corridors lit only by our own equipment, walls lined with dormant machinery that hummed faintly beneath a layer of dust and time. We moved deeper, and I recorded everything, my observer role finally justifying its purpose, though by this point I had stopped thinking of myself as merely an observer and started thinking of myself as something closer to a participant, whether I intended that shift or not. It was Cross who found the chamber at the heart of the structure, a vast circular room dominated by a single massive console, still faintly lit, still faintly alive after what my scanners suggested was well over a century of dormancy. He approached it the way he approached everything, without hesitation, already running his hands across its surface before anyone could advise caution. The console responded to his touch. I do not know how to fully describe what happened next without sounding as though I am exaggerating for effect, but I assure you every word of this account is accurate. The chamber flooded with light. The dormant machinery around us shuddered awake, gears and systems that had not moved in generations grinding back into motion. And from somewhere deep within the structure, a defense system activated, one clearly designed to protect whatever secret this place had been built to guard. A drone emerged from a recessed panel in the ceiling, sleek and dark, its design unlike anything in consulate records, and it did not hesitate before opening fire. I want to note, for the sake of accuracy, that my own instinct in that moment was to retreat, immediately, without discussion. That instinct was correct, according to every principle of self-preservation my species has ever developed, and I stand by it even now. It was also, apparently, not an instinct shared by a single other person in that chamber. Doyle returned fire before I had even processed the drone as a genuine threat. Fox dove behind the console, not away from the danger, but toward better cover from which to assess it. Bennett shouted commands that made no sense to me in the moment, but clearly meant something specific to her crew, because they responded instantly, moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested either extensive prior training or an instinct so deeply ingrained it did not require training at all. Cross, astonishingly, did not retreat from the console even as the drone's fire scored a line across the wall beside him. He kept working, fingers moving across controls he had never seen before in his life, muttering something about pattern recognition and old interface logic, as though the greater danger in this moment was not the weapon firing at him, but the possibility of failing to understand the system before him. I called out to him, my translator struggling to convey the full weight of my alarm, telling him this was not the moment for curiosity, that survival required distance, not deeper engagement with an unknown and clearly hostile system. He did not stop. He told me, without looking up, that if he could just understand what triggered the drone, he could probably shut it down faster than we could outrun it. He was right. I want that recorded clearly, because in the moment I believed him wrong, believed his restlessness had finally led him somewhere none of his previous instincts could save him from. But within 90 seconds during which Doyle and Bennett held the drone's attention through sheer coordinated defensive fire, Cross found the sequence he needed. The drone froze mid-motion, weapon arm lowering slowly, its systems returning to the same dormant silence they had held before his hands first touched the console. Silence returned to the chamber, broken only by our own breathing and the faint ticking of cooling machinery. I stood there afterward, replaying the entire sequence in my mind, and felt something shift permanently in my understanding of these creatures. This was not recklessness in the way I had originally categorized it. Recklessness implies a disregard for danger. What I had witnessed was something else entirely, a willingness to move directly into danger, not despite understanding the risk, but because standing still while a threat remained unsolved felt, to them, like a worse outcome than the risk itself. Bennett found me still standing near the entrance and asked if I was all right. I told her, honestly, that I did not fully know. She placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, a human gesture I had read about but never experienced directly, and said that this was usually how it went. Something breaks. Someone runs toward it instead of away. It gets fixed, eventually, one way or another. I asked her if she was ever afraid during moments like this. She said of course she was. Everyone was. She said the difference was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear be the only voice making the decision. We spent the following hours cataloging the chamber, and it was Fox who discovered the true purpose of the structure, buried in a secondary console she had insisted on investigating even after Bennett had called for the team to withdraw and report their findings before continuing. The structure was a weapons cache, built by a species that no longer existed in any consulate record, sealed away after some catastrophic conflict whose details remained frustratingly incomplete. Whatever had happened here had ended badly enough that the survivors, if there were any, had chosen to seal this place shut and never return. I recommended, formally and with as much conviction as my translator could carry, that we withdraw immediately and report the discovery to the appropriate authorities without further investigation. This was, by every standard I had been trained under, the correct course of action. A weapons cache of unknown origin and unknown capability represented exactly the kind of situation my species was built to approach with maximum caution. Bennett listened to my recommendation carefully. She did not dismiss it. She actually seemed to weigh it seriously, which surprised me more than any of the danger that had come before. But in the end, she made a different choice, one that I would spend the following days trying to fully understand. She decided the crew would document everything they could before leaving, gathering as much data as possible on both the technology and the conflict that had led to its abandonment. Not to use the weapons. Not to claim them. Simply because, in her words, leaving without understanding what had happened here felt like walking away from an open wound without ever learning what caused it. I told her this seemed unnecessarily dangerous, given what we had already survived. She agreed that it was dangerous. She said danger was not, by itself, a good enough reason to stop asking questions. We spent 2 more days inside that structure, and I watched the crew work with a kind of focused intensity I had never witnessed among my own people, not even during our most significant scientific endeavors. They did not rest properly. They barely paused for meals. Every discovery led immediately to another question. Every answer opened 3 new mysteries, and rather than exhausting them, this endless cycle seemed to feed something in them that I still did not have a proper word for. On the final night before our scheduled departure, I asked Cross directly why he had risked his life at that console instead of retreating when I told him to. He considered the question for a long moment, longer than his usual immediate responses, and told me that retreating had never really felt like an option to him. Not because he was brave, he said, and he seemed almost embarrassed by the idea that I might think that. He said it was simpler than bravery. He said the thought of walking away from something unsolved bothered him more than the thought of getting hurt trying to solve it. I filed my second report to the consulate that night, and this time I did not limit myself to a factual account of events. I included my own observations, my own uncertainty, and a question I had never expected to ask in a formal consulate document. I asked whether my superiors had ever considered that the greatest danger humanity posed to the galaxy was not their weapons, not their ships, not their numbers, but this exact quality I had now witnessed twice in less than 2 weeks. An inability to leave anything unresolved. A restlessness that turned every closed door into a personal challenge and every unanswered question into an open wound that needed closing, regardless of what closing it might cost. I did not receive a response before the debris field disappeared behind us. But 3 days later, buried in an archived section of the consulate database I had never been granted access to before, a single file unlocked itself under my clearance level, as though someone, somewhere, had decided it was finally time for me to understand exactly why my people had always kept humanity at such a careful, deliberate distance. The file was old, older than my own service record, and what it described would change the way I understood every human I had met since stepping aboard the Horizon. The record began simply enough, with a date stamp from decades before I was assigned to any post, back when the first formal contact between my species and humanity was still fresh enough to be called an event rather than a fact of history. At that time, a small Ithrain survey vessel had been operating near a border region of contested space, cataloging star systems that had not yet been claimed by any recognized government. According to the file, they encountered a human vessel there, though not one belonging to any official fleet. It was a civilian transport, damaged and drifting, crewed by a small group who had been traveling between colony outposts when their engines failed catastrophically in a region with no friendly support nearby. The record noted, almost as an aside, that the transport had also drawn the attention of a hostile faction operating in that same region, a group of raiders my own archives referred to only by a designation code, their true origin never fully confirmed. These raiders specialized in disabled and vulnerable vessels, and the stranded human transport fit their preferred target profile perfectly. The Ithrain survey vessel detected the situation from a distance and, following standard protocol, began a careful, measured approach, gathering data before committing to any course of action. This was correct procedure. This was what every training document I had ever studied would have recommended. By the time the survey vessel had finished its assessment and formally decided to attempt a rescue, several days had already passed. What the file described next did not match anything in the official summaries I had encountered before regarding this incident. The human transport, alone, without support, without any realistic hope of assistance arriving in time, had not simply waited to be found or waited to be destroyed. According to sensor logs recovered later, the crew had spent every hour of those several days working, not resting, not mourning their apparent fate, working. They had no weapons to speak of, a civilian craft never designed for conflict. What they had was a hull, an engine, a handful of tools meant for basic maintenance, and, it seemed, an unwillingness to accept that nothing could be done. By the time the raiders finally arrived to claim what they assumed would be an easy target, the transport's crew had reconfigured their damaged engine into something resembling a weapon, had rerouted their remaining power into a jury-rigged defense system built from parts never intended for that purpose, and had rigged the hull itself with countermeasures improvised from material never designed to serve any defensive function at all. The raiders did not expect resistance. They received it anyway. The file described the encounter in clinical, detached language, the kind consulate records favor even when describing events that were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The human transport did not simply survive the attack. It disabled 2 of the 3 raider vessels that approached it, using tactics that matched nothing in any known combat doctrine, tactics that appeared to have been invented on the spot, refined through trial and error over the course of a single desperate encounter. The 3rd vessel retreated, apparently unwilling to risk further losses against an opponent that should not, by any reasonable calculation, have posed a threat at all. When the Ithrain survey vessel finally arrived, days later than protocol had dictated but exactly on schedule according to every guideline my people follow, they found the human transport still intact, its crew exhausted but alive, its systems battered but functional, its hull scarred with the evidence of a fight that should have ended in their destruction and had instead ended in their survival. The file included a transcript of the first conversation between the Ithrain rescue team and the human survivors. I read it more than once, unable to fully process what it suggested about the nature of these creatures. The Ithrain officer, whose name has been redacted from the record for reasons the file does not explain, asked the human captain how they had managed to survive against overwhelming odds with no proper weapons and no realistic hope of timely rescue. The human captain's response, preserved word for word, was almost unsettling in its simplicity. She said that sitting still and waiting to die had never seriously occurred to her as an option. She said that as long as there was something left to try, trying felt like the only reasonable thing to do, regardless of the odds against success. The Ithrain officer, according to the file, found this response deeply troubling rather than admirable. Not because it suggested courage, which my people do value and respect, but because it suggested something else entirely. A species that did not calculate odds before acting. A species that treated the absence of a clear solution not as a reason to wait, but as a reason to keep working until a solution appeared, regardless of how unlikely that outcome seemed at the outset. This, the file explained, was the true origin of the caution my own government has always shown toward humanity. Not fear of their weapons, which at that early point in our history were genuinely unremarkable by galactic standards. Not fear of their numbers, which were, and remain, relatively modest compared to some other spacefaring civilizations. The fear, carefully documented and carefully studied across the following decades, was of this specific trait, an inability to accept defeat as a final state, a restlessness that did not diminish under pressure but seemed, if anything, to sharpen and focus precisely when circumstances grew most dire. The file continued beyond that first incident, cataloging similar events across the following years, each one adding further weight to the pattern. A human research outpost, cut off from resupply for months longer than expected due to a navigational error elsewhere in the fleet, had not simply rationed supplies and waited. They had used the time to develop 3 new agricultural techniques that later became standard practice across human colonies, born entirely from restless boredom and an unwillingness to simply endure hardship without also trying to solve it. A human diplomatic vessel, caught in a dispute between 2 hostile factions with no combat capability of its own, had not remained passive while negotiations dragged on. The crew had spent the standoff quietly improving their own vessel's defensive systems using salvaged material from a nearby debris field, not out of aggression, but because the discomfort of remaining vulnerable had apparently outweighed any instinct toward patience. Each incident, read individually, might have seemed like an isolated example of resourcefulness. Together, catalogued across decades by careful Ithrain analysts who clearly understood the pattern long before I ever set foot on the horizon, they painted a picture that unsettled me more deeply than any single dangerous encounter could have. The file's final section contained an assessment written by a senior consulate strategist whose name I did recognize, a figure still active in current diplomatic circles. The assessment concluded that humanity's greatest strength was not military, not economic, not even technological in the traditional sense. It was psychological, a species incapable of remaining still in the face of an unresolved problem, whether that problem was a hostile threat, a scientific mystery, or something as mundane as a piece of equipment that functioned adequately but not perfectly. The strategist had written, and I recall this passage with particular clarity, that most dangerous species in galactic history had been dangerous because of what they built: weapons, fleets, doctrines of conquest. Humanity, the strategist argued, was dangerous because of what they could not stop doing. They could not stop trying. Even when trying made no logical sense, even when the odds suggested that waiting or accepting defeat would have been the wiser course. I sat with that file for a long time after finishing it, turning the implications over in my mind, trying to reconcile this decades-old assessment with what I had personally witnessed aboard the horizon over the preceding weeks. Cross, refusing to retreat from a firing drone because understanding it felt more urgent than surviving it, at least in that immediate moment. Bennett, choosing to investigate a dangerous discovery rather than simply reporting it and moving on. Fox, running simulations against threats that did not yet exist, driven by a restlessness that gave her no rest even when nothing was actively wrong. I began to understand, slowly and with growing unease, that what I had been observing was not a series of isolated incidents specific to this crew. It was the same trait the Ithrain strategist had identified decades earlier, still present, still active, apparently undiminished by generations of technological and social progress that might, in any other species, have gradually smoothed away such restless edges. I brought my concerns to Bennett directly the following day, showing her a redacted summary of what I had found, careful not to reveal information that remained officially classified within consulate archives. She read through it quietly, her expression difficult for me to interpret, and then asked me a question I had not expected. She asked whether my people considered this trait a weakness or a threat. I told her honestly that I no longer knew. Both interpretations seemed to apply, depending on the circumstances, and I found myself unable to fully separate the two. She nodded slowly at that, as though the ambiguity of my answer did not surprise her at all. She told me that humans had spent a great deal of their own history asking the same question about themselves, without ever reaching a clear consensus either. She said some called it ambition and treated it as a virtue to be cultivated. Others called it anxiety and treated it as a burden to be managed. She said the truth, as far as she understood it, was that it was probably both, inseparable from each other, wired into the same restless part of the human mind that could not tell the difference between an exciting opportunity and a looming threat, and responded to both in exactly the same way, by moving, by acting, by refusing to simply wait and see. I asked her whether this trait had ever caused catastrophic harm, whether the restlessness she described so calmly had ever led her species into disaster rather than triumph. She did not pretend otherwise. She told me plainly that yes, of course it had. Wars fought before their time, resources exhausted through impatience. Mistakes made because someone, somewhere, could not bear to simply wait for a better answer before acting on an incomplete one. She said the same trait that had carried humanity to the stars had also, at various points in their history, nearly destroyed them entirely. I found a strange comfort in that honesty. It suggested that humans themselves understood the danger inherent in their own nature, even if they seemed powerless to fully restrain it. It also deepened my unease, because a species aware of its own dangerous instincts and still unable to control them seemed, in some ways, more concerning than one that simply did not know any better. That night, I composed a longer, more detailed report to the consulate, incorporating everything I had learned from the archived file alongside my own first-hand observations from the preceding weeks. I did not recommend any specific policy change, as that fell outside my authority as a simple observer. But I did include a warning, carefully worded, urging my superiors to consider that humanity's danger to the galaxy would not manifest as conquest or aggression in any traditional sense. It would manifest, gradually and almost invisibly, as an accelerating pace of change that other species, my own included, might simply prove unable to match. I did not know, as I filed that report, that within days the horizon would be presented with an opportunity to test that exact theory under circumstances far more controlled and far more deliberate than anything we had encountered in the debris field. A test, I would later learn, designed specifically to determine whether humanity's restlessness could be contained, managed, or turned against them entirely by those who understood its dangers better than humanity understood it themselves. The signal arrived on the morning of our 19th day aboard the Horizon, encoded in a diplomatic frequency reserved for matters of significant interstellar importance. Bennett received it first, and I watched her expression shift from routine attentiveness to something far more serious as she read through its contents. When she finally looked up from the display, she told the assembled crew, and me, that we had just been formally requested to participate in a delicate negotiation between two long-standing rival factions, one that neither my government nor humanity's had managed to resolve through years of careful diplomacy. I did not yet understand the scale of what was being asked of us, nor did I understand that the coming days would place the very trait I had spent weeks studying under a pressure test unlike anything the Horizon's crew had faced before. But I understood, watching the tension settle across every face in that briefing room, human and otherwise, that whatever came next would test not just their skill, but the very nature of the restlessness that had carried them this far. The two factions at the center of the dispute were known to the consulate as the Verath Concord and the Ocylon Trust, both ancient by any measure, both technologically capable, and both locked in a stalemate that had lasted longer than human civilization had existed in its current form. Neither side had struck a decisive blow against the other in generations. Neither side had found a path toward peace either. They existed in a frozen standoff, each too cautious to risk open conflict, each too proud to offer the first real concession. Bennett explained, as the horizon set course toward the neutral meeting point designated for the negotiation, that both factions had specifically requested a joint Ithrain and human presence at the talks. This detail struck me as unusual enough to warrant closer attention. Neither faction had any particular history with humanity, and my own government's involvement in disputes of this scale was typically limited to formal observation rather than active participation. I raised this concern with Bennett directly, asking whether she found it strange that two ancient, deeply cautious civilizations would specifically request the presence of the one species known throughout the galaxy for its inability to sit still. She considered the question seriously, and admitted she found it strange as well, though she had not yet identified a satisfying explanation. We received our answer 3 days later, upon arrival at the meeting point, a vast neutral station constructed generations earlier specifically to host negotiations too delicate to conduct on either faction's home territory. A senior Verath representative, a tall and deliberate creature whose every movement seemed calculated for maximum stillness, met us personally upon docking and explained the true nature of what had been arranged. The negotiation itself, she explained, was largely ceremonial. The real purpose of our presence was something else entirely. Both factions, exhausted by generations of fruitless caution, had agreed to an unusual experiment, one designed to determine whether patience or restlessness represented the superior approach to resolving their ancient conflict. For the following 72 hours, both delegations would remain in a state of enforced stillness, engaging in no active negotiation, no proposals, no counterproposals. Simply waiting, observing each other, in a controlled environment monitored by neutral observers from both my species and humanities. The theory, as the Verath representative described it, drew directly from long-standing Ithrain diplomatic philosophy, that the side capable of enduring stillness the longest, without breaking into premature action, would ultimately reveal itself as the side with the clearer strategic advantage, the side less driven by desperation, the side more likely to secure favorable terms once actual negotiation finally began. I understood immediately why this arrangement made sense to my own government. It was, in essence, a formalized version of the very discipline my people had built their entire civilization around. Whoever could outweight the other side would enter the true negotiation from a position of demonstrated strength. What I did not understand, not immediately, was why either faction believed introducing a human crew into this exercise would clarify anything at all. If anything, based on everything I had witnessed over the preceding weeks, I expected the humans aboard the Horizon to represent the single greatest threat to the stillness this experiment demanded. Bennett voiced a similar concern privately, once we retreated to our assigned quarters aboard the station. She admitted that 72 hours of enforced inactivity sounded, to her, less like a diplomatic exercise and more like a personal trial specifically designed to break her crew's composure. I told her, honestly, that I shared her assessment, though from an entirely different perspective. My people had spent generations perfecting exactly this kind of endurance. Hers, from everything I had observed, had spent no comparable effort at all. The experiment began the following morning. Both delegations, human, Ithrain, Verath, and Ocelon, were seated in a shared observation chamber, each side positioned across from the other, forbidden from initiating conversation, forbidden from proposing terms, permitted only to observe and wait. Neutral monitors tracked every measurable indicator of stress, composure, and restlessness across all participants, data that would later be presented to both factions as evidence supporting whichever approach ultimately prevailed. I settled into my assigned position with something approaching relief, the familiar comfort of enforced stillness, a welcome return to the disciplines of my upbringing. Around me, the Verath and Ocelon delegates settled as well, their expressions calm, their bodies motionless, centuries of similar training evident in every unmoving line of their posture. The Horizon crew did not settle nearly so easily. Within the first hour, I noticed Cross's fingers tapping an irregular rhythm against his knee, a motion he seemed entirely unaware of performing. Fox's eyes moved constantly across the chamber, cataloging exits, cataloging structural details, cataloging anything her restless mind could find to occupy itself despite the explicit prohibition against active engagement. Doyle sat rigidly upright, jaw tight, clearly exerting visible effort to maintain the same stillness the rest of us achieved without conscious strain. By the 6th hour, small signs of distress had become impossible to ignore. Cross had begun quietly disassembling a small data tablet he had been permitted to bring, not out of any productive purpose, simply because his hands seemed to require something to occupy them. Fox had taken to counting ceiling panels, then recounting them, then apparently recalculating some structural detail of the chamber that no one had asked her to analyze. Bennett, to her credit, maintained the most convincing composure of the group, though I noticed her jaw tightening at intervals, the same restrained tension I had seen in her during the debris field encounter, present now not in response to external danger, but to the simple absence of anything to act upon. By the 12th hour, the Vareth and Ocylon delegates remained essentially unchanged, their stillness unbroken, their patience apparently limitless. The human delegation, by stark contrast, had begun to visibly fray. Doyle had resorted to a slow, controlled breathing exercise, clearly a technique learned specifically to manage exactly this kind of enforced inactivity, though even this discipline seemed to require visible effort to maintain. Cross had reassembled and disassembled his tablet 4 separate times. Fox had exhausted every available surface to count, and had apparently begun composing something in her mind, her lips occasionally moving without sound, her restlessness finding an outlet even in the complete absence of any permitted activity. I began to understand, watching this unfold, exactly what the architects of this experiment had intended. This was not simply a test of patience, it was a deliberate demonstration, carefully engineered to prove a specific point to both ancient factions: that humanity, for all its accomplishments, could not endure the kind of disciplined stillness that had allowed species like my own and the Varath to survive and thrive across countless generations. It was designed to expose humanity's restlessness as a liability, a weakness, to be noted and factored into whatever negotiation eventually followed. By the 24th hour, the experiment appeared to be proceeding exactly as its architects had intended. The human delegation showed clear, measurable signs of strain that the Vareth and Ocylon delegations simply did not exhibit. I found myself, uncomfortably, agreeing with the underlying premise of the exercise. Perhaps this restlessness truly was a weakness after all, a trait that made humanity brilliant in moments of crisis, but fundamentally unsuited to the kind of patient, careful diplomacy that had allowed older civilizations to avoid catastrophic conflict for so many generations. And then, somewhere around the 30th hour, something shifted that none of the neutral monitors, myself included, had properly anticipated. Cross, still fidgeting with his tablet, had apparently stopped simply disassembling and reassembling it out of restless habit. I noticed his movements had changed, become more deliberate, more focused, though the exercise still, technically, involved no violation of the enforced stillness protocol. He was not speaking. He was not proposing terms. He was, I slowly realized, quietly mapping something, using the components of his tablet in ways clearly never intended by its original design. Fox, meanwhile, had stopped counting ceiling panels entirely. Her restless energy, rather than continuing to fray under the pressure of enforced inactivity, had apparently redirected itself into something closer to focus. She sat very still now, though not with the practiced stillness of the Varath delegation. Hers was a different kind of stillness, the stillness of concentration rather than discipline, her restless mind apparently having found something to fix its attention upon, even within the narrow confines the experiment allowed. Bennett noticed this shift as well, and rather than intervening, she watched her crew with quiet, careful attention, as though something familiar was unfolding that she had witnessed many times before. By the 48th hour, the Varath and Ocylon delegations remained externally unchanged, their patience apparently limitless, their composure a testament to generations of careful cultivation. But something had happened within the human delegation that the original architects of this experiment had not accounted for. The restlessness that had initially manifested as visible strain had not continued to worsen. It had transformed instead into something quieter, more focused, more directed. Doyle's controlled breathing had steadied into genuine calm, though not the calm of stillness, the calm of a mind that had finally found something productive to occupy the restless energy that stillness alone could never satisfy. I did not fully understand what had happened until the 72nd hour arrived, and the enforced observation period officially concluded, and formal negotiations finally began. Bennett, when given the floor, did not simply present a standard human negotiating position. She presented 3 separate proposals, each addressing a different dimension of the ancient stalemate between the Verath Concord and the Ocylon Trust, each incorporating details about the conflict's history that neither faction had shared with the human delegation directly. When the Verath representative asked, with poorly concealed astonishment, how the human delegation had acquired such detailed knowledge of a conflict they had only just been introduced to, Bennett explained, simply, that her crew had spent the 72 hours of enforced stillness quietly analyzing every publicly available record about the dispute that the station's systems allowed them to access, correlating patterns neither ancient faction had apparently considered in generations of careful. Cross had used his tablet, disassembled and reassembled a dozen times over the course of the experiment, not out of idle restlessness, but to construct a functional analysis tool from components never designed for that purpose, cross-referencing decades of conflict data in ways the station's official systems had never been configured to support. Fox had spent her silent hours mapping resource distribution patterns across both factions' territories, identifying an overlooked strip of contested space that, with the right framing, could satisfy both sides' core demands simultaneously. Doyle, it turned out, had spent his controlled breathing exercises quietly organizing everything his crewmates uncovered into a coherent strategic framework, his restless mind finding order in chaos even while his body remained forcibly still. The enforced stillness that had been designed to expose humanity's greatest weakness had instead been quietly repurposed, without ever technically violating its own rules, into the most productive 72 hours either ancient faction had experienced in generations of failed diplomacy. I watched the Verath and Ocylon representatives study the human delegation's proposals with expressions I had rarely seen among either species. Something between disbelief and reluctant respect. Centuries of careful, patient stillness had produced a stable but unresolved stalemate. 72 hours of restless, redirected human energy, confined within the narrowest possible constraints, had produced 3 viable paths toward an actual resolution. The negotiations that followed, over the subsequent days, built directly upon the framework the Horizon crew had assembled during their supposed period of enforced weakness. I will not claim the process was simple or swift. Ancient conflicts rarely resolve so easily even with a promising framework in hand, but for the first time in generations, both factions found themselves engaged in genuine, substantive discussion rather than the same exhausted, circular caution that had defined their relationship for so long. I filed my report to the consulate that evening, and for the first time since boarding the Horizon, I found myself uncertain how to properly characterize what I had witnessed. The experiment had been designed to prove that stillness, discipline, and patience represented the superior path forward, that humanity's restlessness was ultimately a liability to be managed rather than a strength to be respected. Instead, it had demonstrated something far more unsettling, that humanity's restlessness could not be suppressed, only redirected, and that even under the most rigid constraints imaginable, it would find a way to remain productive, remain dangerous, remain relentlessly, inescapably active. I did not yet know what this meant for the future of relations between my species and theirs. But I understood, more clearly than I ever had before, why the consulate had always approached humanity with such careful, deliberate caution. Not because they were violent, though they could be when provoked. Not because they were reckless, though they often appeared that way to eyes trained in stillness, but because they were, in some fundamental way that no diplomatic experiment could ever fully suppress, simply incapable of doing nothing, and a galaxy full of ancient, patient, disciplined civilizations had never quite figured out how to counter a species that treated every constraint as merely another problem to be solved. The Horizon remained docked at the neutral station for another 9 days, while the negotiations between the Vareth Concord and the Ocelon Trust continued to develop along the framework the crew had assembled during their enforced stillness. I spent much of that time reviewing my own notes, trying to organize weeks of observation into something coherent enough to present formally to my government, though the more I reviewed, the less certain I became that any formal report could truly capture what I had witnessed. On the 5th day of continued negotiations, the senior Varoth representative requested a private conversation with me, separate from the official proceedings. I met her in a quiet section of the station, away from the bustle of both delegations, and she asked me directly, without any of the careful diplomatic hedging I had come to expect from her species, what I truly believed about the humans I had spent the past weeks observing. I told her honestly that I no longer knew how to categorize them, not as a threat in the conventional sense, though the file I had uncovered earlier made clear that older generations of my own government had certainly considered them one. Not simply as an asset either, though their contribution to the negotiation had proven more valuable than generations of patient diplomacy from older, more disciplined civilizations. I told her I believed humanity occupied some category my own species had never needed before, a category defined not by what they built or what they destroyed, but by their apparent inability to ever consider a problem fully closed. She listened carefully, and then told me something I had not expected to hear from a representative of a civilization built on the same disciplined stillness as my own. She said that her people had studied humanity for longer than I had been alive, quietly, cautiously, always from a careful distance, and had reached a similar conclusion decades earlier, though it had never been formally shared beyond the highest levels of Vareth leadership. She said the true danger of humanity was never a danger of conquest, it was a danger of pace. A civilization that could not stop moving would, eventually, simply outpace every civilization that could. I asked her whether this meant her people viewed humanity as an enemy to be contained. She shook her head slowly, a gesture I had learned meant firm disagreement among her kind. She said containment had never worked, not once, not in any of the incidents her government had studied across the decades. Humanity's restlessness did not diminish under pressure. It adapted, it redirected, it found new outlets precisely when old ones were closed off, the same way the Horizon crew had turned 72 hours of enforced stillness into the most productive negotiation preparation either ancient faction had witnessed in generations. She told me that her government's current position, quietly held but firmly established, was not containment, but cooperation. If humanity's restlessness could not be stopped, and every attempt to study it suggested it could not, then the only reasonable path forward was to ensure that restlessness remained aligned with shared goals rather than opposed to them. A restless species working alongside you, she said, was a resource beyond calculation. A restless species working against you was a problem no amount of patience could ever fully solve. I carried that conversation with me for the remainder of our time at the station, turning it over alongside everything else I had witnessed, trying to reconcile the caution my own government had shown toward humanity across generations with the quiet admiration I now heard in the Vareth representative's voice. On the final day before the Horizon was scheduled to depart, with the negotiations between the two ancient factions finally settling into a framework both sides seemed prepared to accept, Bennett invited me to join her crew for what she called a proper meal, the kind humans apparently shared not out of necessity, but out of simple desire for each other's company. I accepted, curious to observe this particular human ritual more closely, though by this point I suspect my curiosity had become less about formal observation and more about something closer to genuine interest. The meal was informal, held in the ship's small common area, and I found myself seated between Doyle and Fox, while Cross argued animatedly with Bennett about some minor technical detail neither of them seemed willing to simply let go. I watched this exchange with the same fascination I had felt during my very first days aboard the Horizon, though the feeling itself had changed considerably since then. Where once I had seen only inefficiency and unnecessary tension, I now saw something closer to a kind of perpetual motion that these creatures seemed to draw genuine satisfaction from, an engine that never fully idled because idling itself seemed to cause them more discomfort than the friction of constant motion ever did. I asked the table, somewhat abruptly, whether any of them ever wished they could simply stop. Stop questioning, stop fixing, stop moving toward whatever unresolved problem currently occupied their attention. The conversation paused, and for a moment I worried I had asked something inappropriate, though humans, I had learned, rarely took offense at direct questions the way my own people sometimes did. Doyle answered first, quietly, without his usual composed reserve. He said he had wished for that plenty of times, especially during difficult moments when the constant pull to act, to fix, to solve, felt less like a gift and more like an exhausting weight he could never fully set down. He said there had been nights, back before he joined this crew, when he genuinely envied species that seemed capable of simply accepting things as they were. Fox nodded at that, adding that the restlessness was not always comfortable, not always productive, and that plenty of humans throughout history had been genuinely harmed by an inability to simply rest, to simply accept an imperfect situation without needing to constantly reshape it into something better. She said her own people had spent a great deal of energy over the generations trying to understand this part of themselves, sometimes treating it as a source of pride, sometimes treating it as something closer to an illness that needed careful management. Cross, more thoughtful than I usually witnessed him being, said that he did not think the restlessness itself was good or bad on its own. He said it was more like a tool, one that had built extraordinary things across human history and also caused a great deal of unnecessary suffering, and that the real difference came down to what a person, or a whole species, chose to point that restlessness toward. He said the same energy that had once driven ancient humans to invent increasingly effective ways of harming each other had also, eventually, driven them to reach beyond their own world entirely, to build ships like the Horizon, to sit at a table with creatures from another star system and share a meal as though it were the most natural thing in existence. Bennett, listening quietly to her crew's answers, finally added her own perspective once the others had finished. She said that humanity had spent centuries trying to decide whether their restlessness was a blessing or a curse, and that the honest answer, as far as she had ever been able to tell, was that it was simply neither. It was a fact of their nature, as fundamental as breathing, and the only real choice available to them was not whether to feel it, but what to do with it once it inevitably arrived. I found myself thinking of the Varath representative's words as Bennett spoke, the idea that humanity's restlessness could not be contained, only redirected, only aligned toward purposes that served rather than threatened the wider galaxy around them. I began to understand, more clearly than I had at any point during my time aboard the Horizon, that the true danger my people had always feared was never really a danger at all in the way we had originally understood it. It was simply a force, immense and largely uncontrollable, that could be turned toward destruction or toward extraordinary progress, depending entirely on the circumstances that shaped it. The Horizon departed the neutral station the following morning, the negotiations between the Varath Concord and the Ocylon Trust finally settling into a lasting framework that neither faction could have reached without the restless, redirected energy of a human crew who simply could not sit still long enough to let an old conflict remain unresolved. I spent the journey home reviewing my final report, trying once more to capture in careful, measured language everything I had learned during my weeks aboard this vessel. I wrote that humanity's restlessness was, in its purest sense, the most dangerous force I had ever personally encountered, more dangerous than any weapon, more dangerous than any fleet, because it could not be reasoned with in the way threats could typically be reasoned with, could not be waited out in the way conflicts could typically be waited out, could not be contained in the way dangers could typically be contained. It simply persisted, restless and relentless, finding new outlets the moment old ones closed, turning enforced stillness into productive preparation, turning closed doors into personal challenges, turning ancient stalemates into solvable problems simply because it refused to accept that some problems were meant to remain unsolved. But I also wrote, and I meant this as genuinely as anything I had ever included in a formal consulate document, that this same force represented something my own species, for all our patience and discipline, had perhaps underestimated for far too long. Not a threat to be cautiously monitored from a careful, guarded distance, but a partner whose restless energy, properly aligned, could accomplish things that centuries of stillness alone might never achieve. I thought again of the human transport crew from decades earlier, stranded and outgunned, refusing to simply wait for rescue or destruction, inventing tactics no doctrine had ever taught them because sitting still while danger approached had never seriously occurred to them as an option. I thought of Cross, refusing to retreat from a firing drone because understanding it felt more urgent than surviving it. I thought of Bennett, choosing to investigate a dangerous discovery rather than simply walking away from an unanswered question. I thought of an entire crew, confined to enforced stillness by an experiment designed to expose their weakness, quietly turning that same stillness into the most productive 72 hours an ancient conflict had witnessed in generations. I understood, finally, sitting alone in my quarters as the horizon carried me back toward whatever assignment awaited me next, that my original assessment of humanity had been correct in one narrow sense and profoundly incomplete in every other way that mattered. They were dangerous. That much remained true, and I do not believe any amount of careful observation would ever fully change that fact. But the danger was never the kind my people had originally feared, never a danger rooted in malice or ambition or conquest in the way older, more familiar threats had always been understood. It was a danger rooted in motion itself, in an inability to accept stillness as a final state, in a restless energy that had carried this strange, remarkable species from the surface of a single small world to the far reaches of a galaxy filled with older, more patient civilizations who had never quite managed to match their pace. And I understood, as the stars shifted slowly outside my quarters window, that the wisest path forward was not to fear that restlessness, not to try containing it the way older generations of my own government had once quietly attempted, but to walk alongside it, carefully, thoughtfully, and with the kind of genuine respect that only comes from truly understanding exactly what you are dealing with. I filed my final report the following morning, closing it not with a warning, as I once might have, but with a simple observation that I believed captured everything my weeks aboard the horizon had taught me. I wrote that the galaxy had spent generations searching for humanity's most dangerous weapon among their ships, their technology, their steadily growing influence across the stars. I wrote that they had been looking in entirely the wrong place all along. Humanity's most dangerous weapon was never something they built. It was something they simply could not stop doing, an ember of restless motion buried so deep in their nature that no stillness, no patience, no careful diplomatic constraint had ever truly managed to extinguish it, and I suspected, closing my report, that nothing ever would. I ended the document there, uncertain how my superiors would receive it, uncertain whether they would view my conclusions as naive optimism or hard-earned wisdom. But as the horizon carried its restless, remarkable crew onward toward whatever unresolved problem awaited them next, I found myself, for the first time since beginning this assignment, genuinely looking forward to whatever came after. Not because I had learned to fear humanity less, but because I had finally learned to understand exactly what made them worth watching in the first place, and worth standing beside, rather than simply observing from a careful, guarded distance the way my people always had before.